they first of all, they live long enough now, and they can organize, and they have. And so we have this constituency, this lobby for the disease. Well, malaria is silent. It's just silent among the people who have it, you know. I mean, it's changing a little bit now, but for all these years, it's the effort has to come from outside, right? So if the effort's coming from outside, how do we do it? You know, well, we do it in a way that makes sense to us. That makes sense, like, okay, it's a money problem. I was actually at a meeting in London once. I'm okay for time? Oh, you gave me time. Okay, good. And it was a bunch of bankers. This is what's funny about the malaria fight today is it's not led by scientists, really. I mean, it's really led by like policymakers and the people who get the money, you know. And then they bring on the scientists to sort of consult with them and things. But there's some scientists here, I think, who are like that comment. So I was at this meeting, and it was all these bankers, these London bankers in their perfectly coiffed suits, and you know, and they said they were raising money for malaria. That was their thing, and they probably raised tons already. And they had a couple scientists around, you know, sort of who were supposed to be giving them sort of extra information and whatnot, and guiding their efforts. And they said to me right off the bat, it was like, you know, the problem with malaria is it's a cash question. It's essentially just money. We just need to raise, you know, $3 billion, and this is over. You know, nobody has to die from a mosquito bite ever again. I mean, in one way, that's totally true. You know, it is a cash question, but yet it's not about just throwing the money at them either. And I was just sitting there taking notes, and the scientist I had come with, he kind of interjected a couple things. And he was like, well, maybe you shouldn't use that number because it hasn't really been, you know, quantified, and, you know, people might get scared off, and why don't we use, you know, he's trying to make these little interventions, and they were just brushing them off. Oh, yeah, you know, just, yeah. Well, the important thing is it's a big number. You know, we don't care what the real number is. It's a big number. And by the end of the meeting, the poor guy was just sitting in the back with his head in his hands, you know, this throbbing headache. So there's all these sort of funny contradictions. We want to do something, but this is how we can get it done, you know. I was in another meeting about malaria, and this is an interesting one because there was actually historians there and scientists there and some policymakers there. And there was a guy there who was from a big philanthropy, and he was going around sort of trying to get African governments on board to do more about malaria. And he was, you know, had these very big ideas about how to do it, and he was a fundraiser. And he had this map of malaria on his, like a PowerPoint. And what he had done is shade in all the countries that ever had any malaria at all. So say in Australia, it's just the northern tip that really has malaria or had malaria. Well, that whole continent was shaded in. The United States, we had malaria mostly in the south, up in the upper Mississippi Valley, a little bit up in the northeast, sporadically in the west. You know, so it's sort of a ink blot on that whole country's colored in. You know, some countries in Europe, in Southern Europe, sporadically Netherlands, et cetera, had some. All of it's shaded in. So it makes it seem like it was much bigger. And then he's clicking through this map showing different years when different countries conquered their malaria. And of course, it looks like this giant malaria monster is just receding, you know, in kind of march step. And which of course is totally counter to what actually has happened with malaria, where it sort of spread, it contracted, it spread, it contracted. You know, but the idea he was trying to put across is it's simple, and I think that's the fundraising message that is what we need to do to be able to raise money to fight malaria, and yet it's exactly the opposite of what's true, because it's anything but simple. It's incredibly complicated. So meanwhile, you know, we're doing all this, and I can talk a little bit more about sort of the ins and outs of how we're fighting malaria and where that's going if people are interested. But while we're doing this effort that's kind of spasmodic, I mean, I think this is the thing that worries me most, is that we have a lot of effort right now, but it needs to be sustained over time, because malaria is like, it's like a flame. You know, if we blow on it and then stop blowing on it, it's going to just roar back bigger. So what we need to do is keep blowing, you know, because if you let one case of malaria slip by your fingers, that person can infect 100 people. So it's hugely infectious. It can lay dormant in the body for many years. as was mentioned earlier. There's certain strains of malaria that can stay dormant for, yes, months, but there's even strains that can stay dormant for decades. And scientists recently found out, actually, that a malaria species that we had always thought was confined to human beings, falciparum malaria, the most dangerous kind of malaria, has actually been found in gorillas in Cameroon and I think Congo. And that's a really worrying thing because it means that there's an animal reservoir for this parasite, in which case, we're never going to get the gorillas to seek out prompt treatment. We're never going to get the vaccine to all the monkeys and apes. So if they're going to be a reservoir for parasites, that means that this is something we're going to live with forever. We also are finding monkey malarias crossing into humans. So malaria is refining its attack on us. We might be sort of gearing up for this fight against this disease, but meanwhile the parasite it's marching forward and becoming more and more sophisticated in its fight against us. Monkey malarias are now being found in human beings too. And this has been happening in Southeast Asia. So it could be that there is not just 4 malaria parasites that feed upon us, but there could be 5 now. And if that mutates more and adapts to our bodies more, that could again become another scourge, a malarial scourge for us. Drug resistance is on the rise already. Our current best medication for malaria is actually based on a 2,000-year-old Chinese remedy. And we already have seen resistance start sparking up in Southeast Asia, and it is starting to spread. And if history holds true, we've seen all the other drugs we've thrown at this disease, resistance starts often in Southeast Asia, and it takes maybe a decade or so to travel across the globe until that drug is no longer useful to us anymore. The mosquito also becoming resistant to the insecticides we use against it. Not just by genetic changes, but behaviorally. They are starting to bite earlier in the evening before you get into your bed net. Because they're flexible. They're going to go out for that blood meal. If this is one thing very clever about malaria. It's relying on the blood meal of the mosquito. This is life and death for the mosquito. It risks its life to get that blood meal. It's to feed its young. It's not even food. If it was just food, it could get food somewhere else. It's not about food. It's more important than food. So the mosquito is going to get their blood meal somehow or the other, and they're learning to circumvent our insecticides. So we need new tools right away. And I think these are quite ominous signs. But again, malaria it's exactly worth fighting. It's exactly worth fighting, not just for the disease itself, but because it's such a huge contributor to poverty, to ill health, to all these other fights get fought when we fight malaria too. So I really think we have great momentum right now, and I hope that this book can be a little bit of an intervention, just to bring people. Just bring this history back to us. We've lost a lot of the history of malaria because of our own history with how the disease left our country, with DDT and our excitement about DDT. We sort of stopped studying malaria for a decade or two after DDT came online. We stopped writing histories about malaria for a decade or two. In fact, what was really interesting putting this book together is there's been a resurgence of interest now, but when I was doing my research, you literally had to get these books, these amazing historical tracts about malaria. There'd be one copy on eBay, discarded from a public library in some junior high school. It was just, or in the non-circulating collections of top academic facilities. So very difficult to get all this stuff together. But I think it's coming back, and I really think now is the time to start bringing this disease back on the world stage. Thank you so much for listening. I'm happy to take questions.
We have about 15 minutes of questions. Again, if you can use the microphone.
So in your research on malaria, did you hear about the possibility of resurgence in the U.S. from climate change expanding the range of mosquitoes or anything like that?
It's controversial how climate change is going to affect malaria. Certainly some places are going to have more risk. But the thing about malaria is it's not just climate. It needs certain climatic conditions. But then you also need population movements and people carrying the parasite into that place. So I think climate change is definitely going to change the malaria map, but whether it'll bring it in here or not, it's probably going to depend more on our public health system.
You mentioned that children are most vulnerable to malaria. And indeed, the highest death rate occurs in young children, and those that survive will develop immunity. And with repeated infections, they